Welcome to the Laser Therapy Institute weekly podcast, the world's first podcast about medical laser therapy for healthcare providers. Each week we discuss the latest research, interviews with experts, and how laser therapy can enhance your practice. Now here is the founder of LTI and your host, Dr. Jason Rountree.
And this is an episode of the LTI podcast. So we're talking today specifically towards healthcare providers. Patients, of course, are welcome to listen in. Uninterested parties or salespeople or whoever you are, everybody's welcome to listen, of course. But we've got several things we're going to cover today that are specifically for healthcare providers. So let me give you a rundown here. We're talking today about laser or photobiomodulation for neurodegeneration. So we're going to talk about what photobiomodulation for neurodegeneration would mean, what neurodegeneration is. We're going to talk about really why and how this works. We're going to talk about the cellular mechanisms and how they lead to the therapeutic effects that we expect with a intervention like this. We've got a couple of cautions to go over, and then we've got some healthcare specific information at the end, like how do you actually use this information in your practice? How do you help patients with this info? So there's a lot of really good stuff.
It's a deep episode.
It's going to be a deep episode.
Yep.
And because of that, because half the people are going to fall asleep halfway through, potentially. You're not allowed to, of course.
Okay.
But we are going to get in pretty deep, so I'm going to give you the bottom line up front, which
good.
is something I was first told about in the military. Give them the bottom line up front first, so that they know where you're going. And then if they need to get the details, they can stick around for the details.
Right.
So today we're talking from a paper that was published back in December of 2020. And
Very recent.
Very recent, yep. Published in Cellular and Molecular Neurobiology. And the title of the paper is The Molecular Mechanisms of Action of Photobiomodulation Against Neurodegenerative Diseases, a Systematic Review. So in this review, they took a whole bunch of studies on light therapies and neurodegenerative diseases, even animal studies, and they combined them all to try and dig out, what the actual mechanisms of light therapy are for neurodegenerative diseases. And when we're talking neurodegeneration, we're talking about dementia, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's chorea, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, ALS. A lot of these central nervous system degenerative diseases that currently have very little hope for therapeutic options, very little hope for even slowing down the progression of the disease. So the bottom line up front on this is that for safe infrared and red light therapy, or photobiomodulation, or as we often say, laser therapy, because we use lasers specifically.
Right.
This is a big piece of trying to find a way forward in the therapies and the fight against neurodegeneration, and that means using safe, non-invasive light, not burning or cutting, to affect this process. Because, as this paper says, neurodegenerative diseases might be slow but relentless as we continue to fail in treating or delaying their progression. Photobiomodulation can be translated to a potential therapeutic tool, acting through a spectrum of mechanisms that work together to decelerate disease progression in the organism, which is difficult to achieve through pharmacologic interventions. So your bottom line there right up front is there is not a lot that can be done for neurodegenerative diseases, and light therapy is a potential therapeutic tool that acts through a whole spectrum of mechanisms in order to affect and delay the progression of neurodegenerative disorders.
Okay.
That's our bottom line. Now, if that was all you wanted to know, see you next time. But if you want to know more, we're going to go ahead and start getting into why and how this works. There are cellular mechanisms that we have to talk about here, and this is going to get pretty deep pretty quick. Now, at the end, we're going to come back around and talk about, again, a couple of cautions about how to interpret this information. And then we're going to talk about how to leverage this info as a healthcare practitioner, as someone who wants to be able to help patients with neurodegenerative disorders, whether you're a neurologist or a PT or a chiropractor or another type of clinician. If this is within your scope, something that you're able to do, you could be a really powerful ally in the fight against neurodegeneration. There are estimates that, huge amounts, over 50% of the population will at some point deal with a neurodegenerative disease
Right.
As we age. And that's horrible.
It is. It is, and it's hard for the person, for the family, for everyone. So.
Yeah. It's one thing when somebody has, an arthritic back and they can't do the things they want to do and there's pain involved. That's bad. Mm-hmm. But when you're losing the person, even though they're still physically there, there's something uniquely difficult about that.
Well, it's the brain slowly dying.
Yeah.
Isn't that?
Essentially. Yeah. That's exactly right.
So
let's talk about the positives here. What photobiomodulation can do on the cellular side. And again, if you find yourself falling asleep here pretty quick, that's all right. You don't have to know all this to understand how to use photobiomodulation. But in so many cases, people go, how does this really work? How does light, safe, non-invasive light that's not doing any burning, any cutting, any destruction, how does that actually help change the tissues? How is that even possible? So there's a number of ways it's possible. So give me one moment because I've got a lot of data here that I need to sort through. Turning pages. Usually I isolate data, but this is so wide-ranging. This study is really cool. If you've got some extra time, go through it yourself and see if you can get a read-through on it. I'm going to give you the high points here, but there's a lot in here.
And we'll link the study to the recording.
Exactly. Yeah, that'll at least be linked on the podcast side. Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
so you can find that. Again, Apple Podcasts is a great place to get that.
Exactly.
So, okay, so number one big picture piece here is that when it comes to cellular mechanisms, photobiomodulation stimulates mitochondrial activity. And of course, the mitochondrial activity is important for cell viability. The mitochondria produces energy for the cell to use. It's the energy factory within the cell. If you have mitochondrial dysfunction, mitochondrial disease, or inhibition, then the cells do not work like they're supposed to. So that's the number one side, is that photobiomodulation exerts a photochemical effect through the stimulation of mitochondrial cytochrome C oxidase, which is a key piece of stimulating ATP production within the cell. Number two is that mitochondrial stimulation, that first one we just talked about, actually triggers several signaling pathways as well. Those are the ERK, CREB pathways, PKC, and so forth. You want to get into that, again, read the paper. If you know what those are, good on you, wonderful. But this is more important because there are three significant paths through which these signaling cascades actually act. And number one is calcium ions. So the increased ATP production and release through the cytochrome C oxidase stimulation, through photobiomodulation, produces a calcium ion influx through the purinergic P2X receptors. Everybody's favorite receptor, right? Yes. Okay. The second one of those, and we're talking signaling pathways here, is through the CAMP pathways as well. So once you have stimulated cytochrome C oxidase again, that raises that initial pathway, but it also increases the production of ATP when it comes to the neurodegenerative cell itself, specifically, not just healthy cells, but the neurodegenerative cell itself. Adenylocyclase can convert ATP to CAMP, and that is then activated through proteins like PKA and RAS. Those mediators activate the further pathways that then lead to further production of reactive oxygen species.
Okay.
Yeah, okay? But if you want to know, if you're the one that's asking, well, how does that really work? This is how it really works.
This is
if
how
you
it
really
works.
want to understand how, this is the how. This isn't just magical light shining down onto the tissues and making them happy. This is physically stimulating the processes within the cells, not only how those processes work and how productive they are, but even how the cell signals to itself, to its own organelles, and to other cells. Now, reactive oxygen species are important because they lead to the activation of other pathways that I won't name, and there's not necessarily always an increase in nitrous oxide signaling or in ROS, but a very short rise in ROS can lead to a lot of different factors, from stimulating repair to stimulating more blood flow, more nutrients into that cell. Short raise.
And the key thing you've said there is repair.
Right.
And regenerate.
Yes. Because when we're talking about degeneration, if you want to reverse degeneration, you have to regenerate.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. Okay. For those 4 people that are still with us, now we need to talk about the intracellular signaling molecules and their pathways too. And I'm going to breeze through this as quick as I can, but this is where it starts to get even more specific and pretty interesting. If you're a neuro geek at all, if you know about some of these pathways, this is really powerful stuff. So the MAPK pathway and the PI3K AKT pathways are all important pathways when it comes to maintaining neurons and maintaining cellular viability. The SIRT1 pathway is another one that's important under stress conditions, especially metabolic stress. And if you keep up with the research on neurodegenerative diseases at all, then you've heard a lot about diabetes mellitus type 3. Have you heard of diabetes mellitus type 3?
No, I have not. That's new.
Right? So you've got type 1. Everybody knows that. Type 1 is one that you're born with. Right? Type 2 is the kind that can happen over time. Right? There's a lot of different factors there. Sugar intake is typically blamed, lifestyle, things like that. There's other factors too. But diabetes type 3...
It's a new one for me.
It's a new one for most people.
Yeah.
And it's not really an official title. It's just kind of what's being thrown around now as this term where the brain is under so much metabolic stress from high sugars, high inflammation levels, that it starts to degenerate. And because it's related to similar diabetes processes and insulin resistance, it's something that they're calling diabetes type 3. And it's really fascinating because you can be non-diabetic and still have this type 3 diabetes process going on that leads to neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's.
Interesting.
Very
interesting.
This is very deep. This is very, very deep, but that's where the science is going. Neurodegenerative diseases are not a simple, just right here is the problem, let's cut that problem out. There are multiple layers, and in most cases, this is a chronic problem that is being manifested by all these different mechanisms, all being a factor. That's why we're going through these mechanisms, these pathways right now, because it's not one pathway, it's multiples. The entire system has to work together correctly to avoid neurodegeneration and these neurodegenerative disorders. The last one of these intracellular signaling molecules that we're going to talk about is heat shock proteins. And heat shock proteins are stress-induced proteins that mediate protein homeostasis and protein folding by acting as molecular chaperones. Yes.
Interesting. I don't have any word for that.
It's great. This is an Indian study, so the translation is really good, but there's a few interesting words like that. Molecular chaperones. I like it.
I like it.
It's a good picture. But these heat shock proteins suppress apoptosis, which is cell death. So apoptosis is programmed cell death. When the cell becomes too stressed, too strained, it'll actually kill itself because it realizes it's not going to survive. So these heat shock proteins help to suppress that apoptosis, which is caused usually by triggers like oxidative stress, hyperthermia or heat, cytotoxicity or cell toxicity, and inflammation. Now, they are identified in neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, Huntington's, amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, and spinocerebellar ataxia. All of those conditions have misfolded proteins as a common disease mechanism. So if we're talking about not just Alzheimer's, but these other diseases too, all of them have these misfolded proteins as a piece of this. And photobiomodulation actually mediates the production and use of these heat shock proteins to protect the system.
Okay.
Now, we start talking about proteins, and people might start, if you're really tied into the neurodegenerative diseases and what happens with Alzheimer's, you get these protein aggregates, these plaques that form in the brain. Now, we start talking about that, and that is another big link here too. So in the amyloid peptide production and hyperphosphorylated tau in Alzheimer's disease, these heat shock proteins are important for deregulating the production of these amyloid peptides. The amyloid peptides gather in these plaques, and they are blamed for a lot of problems. Now, some people think they're more of a symptom than the actual problem itself, but no matter what, they become a problem as they build up, and they form these very visible plaques on the brain. You can see them on MRI. And that's
Wow.
a hallmark for Alzheimer's in particular.
And that just blocks something in the
We
brain?
think it may block something in the brain, and it starts out to be a protective process. It's one of these processes that the body will do to try and protect itself from chronic inflammation and insulin-resistant cell problems. And so it'll try and build up these proteins as a way to protect itself, but then it gets out of control. It's too much, and then we see them start to show up.
Okay.
So they say photobiomodulation was shown in one study to have reduced the amyloid peptide production and the phosphorylated tau in Alzheimer's disease by the upregulation of heat shock proteins. So a really common thing that practitioners and patients alike both will do is they'll think, okay, they're using this laser on my brain, or they're using this light on their brain, and it's dissolving these proteins. Not the case at all. We're stimulating the production of these heat shock proteins, which in turn suppress the production of these peptides.
Okay.
So it's not that we're melting things. It's not that we're destroying anything. We are taking these processes, all these multiple cascades, and making them work better.
So you're slowing down the production of those
Through
plaques, through the
heat shock proteins,
Okay.
which is an important step here, which your body does naturally on its own until it becomes overwhelmed. So we're talking about taking the body's natural processes and just making them happen better and faster.
That's what we have always talked about with laser therapy.
That's exactly right, and that's why laser therapy has such wide applications. If you just take a glance at our list of podcast episodes, you're going to see everything from low back pain to neck arthritis to plantar fasciitis, head trauma. Gosh, what else? I don't know. We've done so many episodes, and it looks like we're saying that laser therapy is the snake oil that works for everything. That's not it. It doesn't work for everything. But because light therapy works by stimulating the body's natural processes in a positive direction, it works for a lot of things.
Right.
Because your body's made to repair. So if you can enable it and help it work faster, then you're going to get the body's natural process working in the right direction. So that's why laser therapy has a great promise in so many different things. Sideline there.
That's exciting to think that. I mean, it's just amazing.
Yeah.
I just am still amazed at how well laser therapy works for most things.
Well, yeah. I mean, your body is made to survive.
Right.
Your body is not made to fall apart. Even as you age, the body fights to stay at its top level of performance. And if anything you can do to enable it to stay there means slower aging, better cellular performance, which translates to less disease, translates to better function, better quality of life. So, okay.
Okay.
So that's our side note there. If you haven't fallen asleep yet, that was just looking at the cellular mechanisms, and then how that translates into the intracellular signaling molecules and pathways. So that's all within the cell. Once you take those intracellular mechanisms and pathways and you translate them into broader, organ-wide, brain-wide effects, that's where you have to start talking about the actual therapeutic effects, going from the signaling platform all the way into what does that look like in the brain itself. So number one, all those mechanisms, all those signalers lead to a prevention of neuron atrophy. So neurons are brain cells, right? Preventing them from shrinking, preventing them from dying is a big step in preventing neurodegeneration. That makes sense probably to most people, right?
Yeah.
So they say photobiomodulation was found to attenuate dendrite atrophy caused by the amyloid beta plaquing in hippocampal neurons. Also, it increases hematopoietic stem cells in circulation, and those are important for blood production, but just seeing more active stem cells in general in circulation means that we should be stimulating repair processes. Also, photobiomodulation restored dopamine content by increasing the expression of the dopamine transporters and tyrosine hydroxylase, which is the enzyme responsible for producing dopamine. What's dopamine?
It's an enhancer. I mean, it makes you feel good. So.
Yep, exactly. And it's a big piece of
increase.
why... Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, go.
It's a big piece of why a lot of neurodegeneration patients also face things like depression and anxiety. So not only memory performance, and things like that, but also mood is a big factor with these two. And so we're talking, in this case, preventing neuron atrophy by the direct mechanisms of this intracellular signaling we just talked about. Also increasing stem cell circulation to areas that are damaged in particular, and then increasing dopamine production. So those are big steps right there.
I was gonna say, that seems huge.
Yeah, I mean, you'll have drugs that try to do just one of those steps.
Right, and we just don't want to go down that drug trail.
We're going to talk about that drug trail here in just a minute, because everybody would love to have a drug or a pill or something that just makes my brain better. It's not that simple.
No.
That's what we're about to get into
No.
here towards the end, but I've got more therapeutic effects to throw at you first.
Okay,
Are you awake?
I am.
Okay, good.
This is, I find this very interesting.
Well, I do too. I like to talk about, hey, we can fix rotator cuff tears and things like that. That's fun. That's easy to talk about. Breaking down the cellular mechanisms, though, is important if you want to really understand what you're doing when it comes to delivering photobiomodulation. If you're a laser therapy provider and you don't understand some of these pathways, then you're not going to be able to answer questions when patients ask them.
Right.
And you don't have to understand it perfectly, but you have to have at least a comprehension of what you're doing, because you're not heating up the skin.
No.
You're not dissolving proteins.
No.
You're stimulating the body's processes, and this is the nuts and bolts of how that's actually happening.
And that's really amazing, incredible that it works that way.
Well, there's more to come, because the next piece is that
Let's go.
photobiomodulation brings about neuroprotective and anti-inflammatory responses, decreasing cytotoxicity. That is a big step when we're talking about diabetes type 3, where we have consistent chronic inflammation causing dysfunction and causing nerve damage. You can reverse that with photobiomodulation.
That's key. Reverse.
Yep.
I mean, you can't do that with a lot of things.
Yes.
You can try to cover it up,
Yep.
but to reverse it with photobiomodulation, that's amazing.
Yeah. This is not
So-
placebo effect stuff. This
No.
is all verified. Now, these are animal studies. We're going to talk about that in a minute too. But you have to do animal studies to find these kind of effects,
Yeah.
and then translate that then to human studies, right? The next one is that photobiomodulation prevents apoptosis by increasing BCL2 and BCL-XL, increasing BAX, and suppressing the activity of capsase-3 and capsase-9. Those are important because when you prevent apoptosis in these amyloid beta cells, it lifts beta-catenin inhibition, and that big cascade of events leads to decreased apoptosis or cell death from cells that are damaged. The brain doesn't build new neurons to replace dead neurons. So now it can reroute damage, it can reprogram neurons. That's where we get into neuroplasticity, which is really exciting stuff too. But in the first place, if you can keep those cells alive, if you can repair them to the point that you keep them alive and repair those, then you don't have to worry about the cell death being a significant factor here.
Okay.
The next one, because I'm like halfway through this list. It's ridiculous. It's a great study. There's just a lot of details. But you asked for this. You wanted to know, how does it work? How does it really work? What happens on the head when or in the brain when I'm putting light on the brain? Well, all this. And this is just what we understand at this point. All right, the next piece is that we increase antioxidant capacity, which is an important part of being protective for any cell, not just nerves in the brain, but improved antioxidants are protective. Also, we get increased mitochondrial function and preservation, not just through increasing the activity of producing ATP, but in addition to improving mitochondrial oxidative phosphorylation through cytochrome C oxidase. Already talked about that. It also raises MMP and improves ATP production. It also affects the mitochondrial dynamics by altering the fusion and fission processes. So, photobiomodulation preserves the expression of fusion proteins and prevents the shift towards fission and fragmentation. That is a step that happens in the cell when there's significant damage or stress.
Okay.
The mitochondria stops functioning as well and starts to actually get to the point where it will break apart and die. When that starts to happen on a large enough scale, the entire cell will die. Or it'll trigger apoptosis, like we were just talking about, cell death, programmed cell death. So, we went from talking about cell death in general to now we're talking about the actual organelle, the mitochondria itself, preventing it from going into fission and fragmentation, which is a step in apoptosis. What I want you to see with all this is that it's all linked. It is all just enmeshed. All these effects. You can't just pick one of these out and say, oh, well, let's increase ATP and that will save the brain. It's not the case at all. All these effects are linked and essential to each other. Okay? The next piece that it does is it does actually reduce the amyloid plaque burden, meaning that it reduces those amyloid plaques that form on the brain. We've already talked about that. Those are maybe more of a symptom than the actual disease, but we are spending tens of thousands of dollars on drugs that have been shown to reduce amyloid plaque. Aduhelm is a brand new drug, well, brand new as of last year, delivered in infusion every month. I've talked about this one on the podcast before.
Right.
And it costs $5,000 a month.
That's incredible.
And it's people are supposed to be on it for life. And the only evidence we have that it works is that they get some decrease in these amyloid plaques. No indication that it actually improves function or quality of life or memory or anything.
But yet, people are still doing it.
People are still doing it. And now Medicare has been roped into paying for it, which means that I'm paying for it. You're paying for it too, for these people to get it.
But what are the side effects?
What are the side effects? Yeah, that's a good question
I mean,
too.
that's.
I mean, if it doesn't
there's no guarantee it's working, but
there's no guarantee it's working.
Could be other side effects that are going down different
Everything
trails.
has a side effect.
Yeah.
So what are we really getting out of these, $60,000 a year infusions for patients? Well, you know what? If it was saving their quality of life and helping them be better, hey, maybe that's worth it. But the evidence isn't there to say that it is.
The evidence isn't there.
To the point that people on the FDA advisory committee actually resigned when this went through because they disagreed with the level of evidence, and it still got pushed through.
Wow.
So, I mean, and when you compare the narrow effects of a drug like that to what we just talked about here, this enmeshed, intertwined system, how can just reducing those amyloid plaques do anything? You still have all these other factors that you're not addressing.
Right.
And so that's going to take us into one of our cautions here in a minute. We'll get there soon. I've still got more effects to talk about.
Hang on.
All right. If you're listening to the recording and you're bored, fast forward. But if you can pick up some of this, it'll be useful for you, hopefully. Okay. The next piece here is that photobiomodulation activates a multidimensional stress response system in the cells. Meaning, again, we're not just getting rid of this protein, right? This amyloid plaque protein. We're changing the entire stress response system in the cells. We're activating all the emergency systems in the cells to trigger repair, right? That's a big difference, because it's to the point where if you use photobiomodulation on these damaged cells, you actually alter the expression and activity of the genes and proteins involved in mitochondrial dynamics to alleviate mitochondrial stress. We already talked about mitochondrial stress leading to fragmentation and fission and reversing that, but we're also talking about even changing the expression of genes within the mitochondria to protect it and enhance it. Multiple pieces.
Yes. But it all works together.
It all works together. Yeah. The next piece, as they say, is that photobiomodulation influences an interconnected network of cellular signaling towards a beneficial effect. So it affects multiple pathways, multiple proteins, each of which often regulates very different functions in the same cell type. I won't go into the details on that one. That's a good read, though, too. Just in the same cell type, you can activate all these different types of responses through photobiomodulation. This isn't a drug. We're just putting light, the right kind of light.
Non-invasive
light to activate this. Now, that's where you get to the total effect. That's what I've been leading up to with all this. All this stuff feeds together to create a total effect of neuroprotection and resistance to degeneration. But this is really cool. This is one of the first times I've seen this really outlined like this in a paper. They say photobiomodulation shows pathology-dependent effects. So in one study on diabetic retinopathy, they said that photobiomodulation increased PAKT and PHSP27, while other studies on Alzheimer's disease actually reported an increase in those proteins and in the PAKT as well. So that means that it was doing two different things on two different types of pathology. In one, it increased these, in the other, it decreased. That's a big deal because activation of AKT is beneficial in Alzheimer's disease, but it has the opposite effect in diabetic retinopathy. It does more harm than good. So if you really break that down, either the laser is intelligent or the light therapy is actually triggering a response that is disease dependent.
So the light is helping the body do what it's supposed to, and it knows what to do when it gets stimulated.
Yep. And more than the light knowing, it's that your cells know what to do.
Yeah.
And the light stimulates cells, and so therefore you can see different effects even across same cell lines in different types of pathology.
Yep.
It's wild. It's wild. You can't get that with drugs, ever. That's why drugs have side effects. If you want to stimulate this process, it does it to all these different areas, and that's helpful in some cases and not in other cases.
Right.
In this case, light therapy actually stimulates a beneficial response in this pathology and a different response that's beneficial in this other pathology.
That's amazing.
That's wild.
That is.
There's nothing else like that.
No.
So, not only do we have total effects on the cellular mechanisms, the therapeutic effects that can happen in the brain, you have pathology-dependent effects as well. And this all sounds like, wild, earth-shaking stuff, and it is, and it's not talked about enough. But there's a few cautions to get into. Number one is that we got to go down a different pathway with drugs.
Definitely.
And that's what this paper really shows. And they say that singularly targeting a particular signaling cascade is bound to fail, as seen with most pharmacological drugs for neurodegenerative diseases so far, since each pathway intersects with others to bring about a collective outcome. Suppressing or enhancing any one part of that complicated program can very often cause a whole different outcome. That's already what we've been saying.
Yeah.
But they say it plain as day here. You can't just target one thing. You can't just target the amyloid plaques. It leaves off the whole rest of the system, and it has other effects, exactly like you just said. So you have to be targeting the entire system. Secondly, other than symptomatic treatments, most drugs aimed at slowing the disease progression fail in human studies, even though they showed promise in animal models. That's how we've gotten to where we're at right now, is that we see these animal studies, we talk about findings from animal study papers, and then we implement drugs that are supposed to do the same thing, and it doesn't work as well when it gets to the human side. And there are differences, animal and human, even though there's similarities.
Right.
But we have to be careful even taking this photobiomodulation information and trying to translate it directly to human too. So while we can learn a lot from these animal studies and a lot about the cellular mechanisms, we can't simply take what these researchers did with their photobiomodulation settings and protocols and translate that directly to humans. It doesn't work,
Right.
unfortunately. So you have to take these principles, though, and see how to translate them to humans. So if you're a healthcare provider, how do you use all this info? Well, number one, you're probably not going to use a lot of this on the day-to-day. You're just not. I think it's important to know it, to have it out there, and if you want to maybe workshop, neurodegenerative diseases with a patient, or you want to understand this process better, understand why the medications don't work, this is good to know. But to try and take what they saw in research on mice and other animal studies here from this paper and translate that directly to people does not work very well. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is that the wavelengths they used for these mouse studies is typically in the visible red spectrum. Visible red light can do amazing things. However, one of the things it can't do is get through the skull.
Right. That was one thing I was thinking of earlier on, is we've got the skull to get through.
Exactly. They say for neurodegenerative diseases, the most commonly used application mode is transcranial, where the light is applied directly to the head. If you're going to do that, you've got to be able to get light to the brain, through the skull, through the hair, through the scalp, through the dura that surrounds the brain. And red light simply cannot do that, which discounts some of what you see here. However, we know that infrared light of certain wavelengths can reach the brain and can stimulate a lot of these same pathways. So there is a way to get there. The problem is we don't have as much research yet as we need to really show us what are the settings we need to use, what are the wavelengths we need to use, how often do you treat the person, what are your power settings, what's your fluence, what about pulse rate, where does all this come in, right? That's the difficulty that this study simply cannot answer, and it's not trying to answer that.
Right.
We're just looking at cellular effects, mechanisms. So what do you do with this as a healthcare provider then? If you want to use laser, it probably sounds like I'm saying that we just need to wait for research. We don't necessarily need to wait for research because there's more every year. But if you understand this process, you understand a bit about how this works, you can translate that to clinical practice. If you want to do all the homework yourself, you can. It'll be a lot of work. Or you can let us do it for you. Because here at LTI, we actually provide protocols, settings. We can help guide you on your laser equipment purchasing. We can help you with practice coaching. We can help you set up an entire laser practice and be able to be successful with a multitude of disorders. And actually, I'm on a coaching call later today even talking to one of our members about how to make sure that we're implementing transcranial light therapy safely and correctly, because it can be done very easily, and we've already done the legwork for you. So if you have questions about that, you just need to reach out to us.
Yep.
Okay, I've talked out all the words that I need to talk about.
I'm still processing everything that you said. It's very, very interesting, but knowing how it works is key. Whether you understand that all doesn't, you still need to translate it into your practice.
Right.
But like you said, we've got a leg up on that with the protocols that have been developed here.
Absolutely. Yep.
So.
LTI protocols are based on research like this, as well as seeing what works in clinical practice, over 10,000 visits a year that we see here in the home clinic, as well as multiple thousands of visits per year in LTI clinics around the country. If you want to become a part of that, look us up, lasertherapyinstitute.org. If you have questions, shoot us an email, info@lasertherapyinstitute.org. And if you don't mind, leave us a rating or a review on our podcast if you're listening on the podcast, or share this on Facebook where you're seeing it right now. Thanks very much for coming along.
Subscribe now to keep learning about the growing field of laser therapy. Check out our patient-focused podcast, Healing at the Speed of Light, a great resource for your patients. For massive practice growth and improved patient outcomes, become a certified Laser Therapy Institute clinic. Learn how at lasertherapyinstitute.org.